next is our next speaker, Thomas Kuhn, head of ESG indexes. I also apologize, I did not start today by thanking Baruch College for opening up their fabulous facilities to us today. Baruch is always a terrific partner with my office on trying to bring more policy discussions to a broader universe, and we have Eric Lugo in the back representing the college. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much. I would also like to thank Baruch College and Senator Krueger for setting up this event today, and I would like to commend CIO Fuller and the Comptroller for their leadership on climate-related issues in investment. It's a very important area. A little bit of background on MSCI for those of you who may not have heard of us. Just to, show us, raise your hand if you've heard of MSCI. A number of people have, but many have not. MSCI is an index and risk analytics firm. It's a publicly traded company with about 3,200 employees in 30 countries across the world. It also has the largest ESG, environmental, social, and governance research business in the market, and we combine at MSCI the expertise on indexes, risk, and ESG to create ESG benchmarks used by investors. And just to give you a sense of the scale, approximately $10 trillion is benchmarked to MSCI's indexes. So in a very benchmark-driven world, MSCI's benchmarks are extremely important. So one of the things we see is essentially a 360-degree view of investments across the globe. My background is that I started out as a college professor, so it's nice to be back at the university. And after that, I began working at what was then called an SRI research firm based in Boston called KLD. That was about 24 years ago. Through a series of acquisitions, I find myself at MSCI, and I can tell you the world has changed in this regard over the last quarter century. But what's really relevant here is that starting in 1995, we began looking at climate change, what we call global warming at the time, as a factor that investors ought to be taking account of. So this is not new. Let me also provide a kind of credit to Carbon Tracker Initiative for their work here. Frankly, we wouldn't be up here were it not for the work of Carbon Tracker, whose research was then picked up by Bill McKibben, who created 350.org, and the combination of the high-quality research of Carbon Tracker and the ability of McKibben to summon up the energy of a generation of college students to focus on fossil fuel divestment is really what's brought us here today. And I think it's a very interesting confluence of events. What is our role in this? Well, MSCI as an index provider is essentially a scorekeeper on markets. When we started looking at this issue, we were interested in it because of our role not only as benchmark providers but as an ESG research provider, and decided that we could provide resources for fiduciaries thinking about these issues. And so, among other things, we did back tests on what fossil fuel divestment would look like had it begun in the early 2000s. We developed a carbon data set. We created both ex-fossil fuel and low-carbon benchmarks, which I'm going to reference in a couple of minutes. And we've done applied research on this issue, and one of our papers won an award from the Investor Responsibility Research Institute. So this is an area where we've had a role in terms of providing information that helps people think through these questions from a risk and return perspective and as fiduciaries. And I should make clear that we have no view on what's the right thing to do in this context, because our job is to help our clients, whether they're asset owners, consultants, investment consultants, or asset managers, think through these questions and to address the questions that they bring to us. So just a couple of thoughts on sort of what we're seeing in the market. First of all, we've detected a strong interest in the whole divestment question in our client base. We've had dozens, if not hundreds, of conversations with colleges and universities, pension funds, family offices, and foundations who are confronting this question. For those that want to divest, we have created both ex-coal and ex-fossil fuel indexes. They're very much focused on the question of reserves and ensuring that companies that own reserves that are used for energy production are not included in these benchmarks. We also, at the request of initially of some European, large European pension funds, created what we call low carbon indexes. And if we think about fossil fuel reserves and the owners of fossil fuel reserves, they attack or focus on a particular element of carbon exposure in portfolios. And that is the reserves ownership for the reasons that were referenced earlier. But what we also know is that in addition to the reserves owned by oil, gas, and coal companies, every company has carbon emissions. And the whole question of carbon exposure is not simply about reserves, but is also about emissions. And we created benchmarks that are low carbon benchmarks that accomplish a couple of important goals. One is that they take account of both dimensions of carbon, emissions and reserves. And the second is they're designed in a way that they reduce the risk that is taken by, as a result of lowering exposure to carbon in those benchmarks. And the question of tracking error was brought up in the initial comments by CIO Fuller. And what we have found is the following. In our conversations, there are institutions that are interested in fossil fuel divestment. They go that route. Many who are brought to the question of whether or not they should divest, for a number of reasons, primarily fiduciary reasons, opt for low carbon solutions. And a good example of that is CalSTRS, the California State Teachers Retirement System, which just a few months ago committed to invest $2.5 billion of their assets in low carbon strategies. And so I think that what's important here is to sort of ask ourselves, what's the objective? And then from the perspective of the different actors in this on this question, what's the appropriate actions for them to take? And I don't think there is a single solution. I think what we need, and Elizabeth's remarks I think point to this as well, what we really need are actions by different actors out there, different stakeholders in the community, whether they're community-based or investors. What we need are appropriate actions that take into account the carbon question, but do so in ways that are appropriate for their institutions. And my view on this, and again, we don't have a particular perspective as a company on what the right thing to do is. My view on this is that what we're seeing up here is that there are a number of different vectors all pointing in similar directions to address the impact of climate on the different stakeholders that we're looking at. In the case of investors, the issue is ultimately about what risk does climate change pose to their investment portfolios. So,
Thank you very much.